joined us a few minutes early. This is going to be the Never Again live podcast with Meir HaLevi Weinstein, our host, and special guest Meir Jolovitz will introduce shortly. I'm going to give you all a few minutes to click on, so we're just going to wait. And remember, you could join us on YouTube, on Twitter, on Facebook, or go right to our website, which is israelnow.ca. We see a few of you already joined us, so please do go and share this right now with your pages on Facebook and your groups, and just share it around. Remember, we do have a live chat where you can send in messages, and if you'd like them on the screen, please let us know. Remember, these are not anonymous, so you'll be posted with your name. Tonight's program will be the topic, the heated debate going on right now, which we feel is kind of a silly debate and unnecessary but dangerous. And is there a conflict between Zionism and democracy? And what are these protests really about? So without any further ado, we're going to get ready to start our program. A short introduction, then we'll bring the mayors on the screen. And after the intro, I'll be back in about 30 minutes for a little more entertaining value. Remember, you can join us live on our website, israelnow.ca, YouTube, Facebook, as well as now on Twitter as well. It's an important topic, a pressing topic, and certainly a special topic. The protests going on in Israel presently by the progressive left wing. The question is there a conflict between Zionism and democracy? And that'll be the topic of our discussion tonight, as well as a little history later. What are these protests really about?
Well, around 80,000 demonstrators took to the streets in Tel Aviv to protest against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's new government and its plans for sweeping changes to the country's justice system.
And now tens of thousands may have been at the protest last night, but the Israeli public did overwhelmingly vote for the Likud-led coalition. And one of its main campaign promises was a reform of the justice system in Israel.
Well, the left, which lost the elections and lost the people, actually, tries to stick to the government or to govern the state through the judicial system as it was used to since 1995, since Judge Aaron Barak took over the Supreme Court and changed it totally to be a super ruler of the state of Israel above the Knesset and above the government. Now time has come in order to correct the situation and to put the judicial system in a parallel status, parallel to the Knesset and to the government, and not above it, as the people who gathered yesterday in Habima were used to. Well, we have news for them. This is not democracy, when the Supreme Court of 15 people who were not elected by the people control everything in this country. This is not a democracy anymore.
The world is a dangerous place, not because of those who do evil, but because of those who look on and do nothing. And here at IsraelNow.ca, the Never Again Live podcast, we're active, we're proactive, so please join us in our struggle against anti-Semitism. Go to our website, IsraelNow.ca, and share our podcasts. All of them can be found on our website, all past podcasts. So join us at IsraelNow.ca. And here's Meir.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This show is being broadcast live on our YouTube channel. It's being broadcast through Facebook. It's being broadcast through Twitter. So I'm going to ask everyone. It's being broadcast also through our website, IsraelNow.ca. So I'm going to ask everyone, whoever is joining us from whatever platform you're watching us, if you could please share this with whatever platforms you use, be it different social media platforms. We'd really appreciate it. We'll reach a lot more people, and that's what we want to do. I just want to start. This week's Torah Parsha is Ve'era, and it's really interesting what goes on in Ve'era, because we just finished Parsha's Shemot, where Moses had his first encounter with Pharaoh, and he told the Jewish people, God said that I have to speak to Pharaoh, and I'm going to lead you out of Egypt. And in this Parsha, Moses is talking to God, and he's saying, you sent me, and I spoke to Pharaoh, and it's not only is it not happening, but Pharaoh increased the burden on the Jewish people. And God tells Moses, go back to the Jewish people and speak to them and tell them that I'm going to perform signs and wonders and everything, and they're going to go. And Moses does. He speaks to the Jewish people, and the Jewish people, they're so run down and tired from the back-breaking labor that they're going through. They're slaves in Egypt, and the burden was even increased after Moses had his visit with Pharaoh. The burden was even hardened. It was even worse, the conditions. So they're tired. They don't even respond to Moses, and Moses feels like, what's going on? The Jews aren't even listening to me. How is Pharaoh going to listen? That's how it happens. So there's a lot of confusion going on. Ultimately, everyone knows the story. The redemption came. We left Egypt. But at this period of time, there was mass confusion going on. And that's what's going on in Israel right now. Mass confusion. Democratic elections in Israel. The majority of the Jewish people in Israel vote for this coalition. How is that? They have 64 seats out of the Knesset, which is 120 seats. Of those seats, there are Arab parties that totally reject the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state. So if you look at the Jewish population, who's voting for what, it works out, if you do the math, it works out to approximately 70% of the Jews in Israel voted for this coalition government. That's very significant. Second thing, this government wants to affect change. The Supreme Court in Israel, it's not like the Supreme Court in the United States, it's not like the Supreme Court in Canada, how judges are elected. No, they elect themselves. They have their buddy club. And we're going to really get into this, but today the Supreme Court actually invalidated Aryeh Deri, the leader of the Shas party, in an effort to throw the coalition government into complete turmoil. Now we'll see what's going to happen, but like I said, with the Parsha, there was confusion amongst the Jewish people. What's going on? We want the redemption. We want to be free. just like you said, Moses. But now, what's going on with this election? Netanyahu promised all kinds of things to the Jewish people, the overwhelming majority of the Jewish people, how things are going to be, what we're going to fight for. And there's a lot of good stuff that has happened already. So Smotrich took an action to impose sanctions on the Palestinian Authority. Who is the Palestinian Authority? You know, 2 nights ago, Jews went to Joseph's tomb to pray. They had to be protected by the Israeli army. Now, in the Oslo Accords, the Oslo Accords has been continuously violated by this Palestinian Authority, continuously. In the Oslo Accord agreements, Jews are supposed to have access to holy sites, such as Joseph's tomb. And the Palestinian Authority is supposed to ensure safe passage. Well, no. There's no security from the Palestinian Authority. In fact, the previous chief of staff, Aviv Kochavi, he said in many Arab towns throughout Judea and Samaria, in many of these towns, the Palestinian Authority exercises no control. So the IDF has to take matters into their own hands to fend off these terrorist groups. So when the Jews were going to Joseph's tomb 2 nights ago to pray, just to pray, what you had was terrorists shooting at them, throwing Molotov cocktails. You see the buses that are coming in or leaving, the Jews coming and going to Joseph's tomb, under a hail of bullets and Molotov cocktails and grenades. All kinds of explosives. Palestinian Authority goes to the United Nations to try to impose sanctions on Israel and other measures and delegitimize Israel. Who do they represent? And who is involved also in shooting at the Jews going to pray? The Islamic Jihad has recruited kids, teenagers. And when they're shooting at you and the IDF shoots back, and some of them are killed, they're teenagers, like 13 years old, 14 years old. Pictures are posted all over social media. Innocent kids. They're not innocent kids, but could you imagine? Kids of that age and younger are raised by the Palestinian Authority to hate Jews and want to kill Jews. Har Bayit, Jews go up. It's an international crisis that goes on when Jews go up. The Jordanian ambassador to Israel went up there, made an international incident out of it. He goes up, an Israeli police officer wants to check his credentials, doesn't recognize the person. All of a sudden, Jordan wants to impose it. You know, Israel has sovereignty over the land of Israel. And it's about time Israel imposes that sovereignty. And with all these issues happening right now and all the confusion going on, maybe it's a blessing in disguise because we know what we have to do as Jews. We know what we have to do. I have with me tonight Meir Jolovitz. We're going to get into this issue. And it's great to have Meir with us, who's going to shed a lot of light on what's going on here. And I encourage people who are watching, our viewers, you know, if you have any questions or comments, we have an active chat. Post them. We'll try to address some of them. But again, I want to welcome Meir Jolovitz for being with us. Meir, are you on the screen?
I am, I think. I am.
Okay, very good. How are you doing tonight, Meir?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well because we no longer have a leftist government in Israel. And proof of the fact that we don't have a leftist government of Israel is all the noise that's being made by the left,
Right.
which is in fact a minority, protesting the Israeli government. I like when the left protests the Israeli government. It means that they're doing things that you and I believe need to be done.
Right.
On several previous broadcasts, and I'm sure in future broadcasts with you and podcasts, I made the comment, and I've made the comment, I will continue to make the comment, that there's a war going on. And it's a war of ideas. It's a war of ideas, and until we re-elected a government which seems to speak for Jewish nationalism, which I trust that this will, it was a war that we were losing. It was a war that we were losing at the United Nations. It's a war that we were losing with the media. It's a war that we're losing with the European Union. It's a war that we're losing certainly with the American government, the Biden administration. It's a war that we were losing in academia. It's a war that we're losing on campuses. And it's a war, tragically, if you look at the future of our next generation and the one beyond, it's a war that tragically we might be losing with the youth of today, who aren't going to be the Zionists of tomorrow. As a backdrop, let me just throw this in. Everybody knows this, but it's not set up enough. Zionism is nothing more and nothing less than the Jewish national liberation movement. That's
Absolutely.
what it is.
Yes.
If you're pro-Zionist, you believe that the Jews are entitled to a state of their own, a Jewish state. And if you're anti-Zionist or not, you don't believe that. It comes down to that. What's remarkable is that in Israel, there's this element that fashions themselves Zionist, and that could be qualified because a lot of the leftists believe that we live in a post-Zionist society. But nonetheless, these people who fashion themselves to be Zionists, and yet they take a position which is diametrically opposed to the very concept of a strong and secure Jewish state. And that is that war of ideas that I speak about that we are fighting right now. And as you mentioned, and the numbers have changed, how many, 15,000, 80,000. There was actually one report, it was a liberal leftist media source, which the evening that the demonstration against this present coalition government, and as they claim, and they know how to usurp language. They're just absolutely wonderful in using language to make their case. I wish we would do as well. At one point, they had actually said that they believed that this was 800,000 people demonstrating in Israel, which far surpassed the 500,000 which once demonstrated about Oslo. But nonetheless, the reality is, as you mentioned, that the majority of Jews in Israel, whatever their political proclivities might be, whatever political parties that they voted for, the majority of Jews in Israel voted for a government that now sits with a coalition of 64. And the best friend that the Arabs of Israel and the Arabs who come into Israel have, tragically, once again, is the High Court in Israel, Bagatz, the Israeli Supreme Court. And we'll talk about it because there are a number of things which have transpired just in the last 36 and 48 hours. But there is a war going on, and we need to recognize it.
I want to ask you a question, Meir. So the Labour Party came into being, when the Labour Party came into being in 1992, they had, I believe they formed a coalition government, and it was 62 seats. And they brought about a radical change. The Oslo Accords, they brought Yasser Arafat from Tunisia into Israel. They allowed the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. Israel provided weapons to them, all kinds of arms. Where was the talk, democracy and, there were protests, but those who were protesting against the Oslo Accords, they were called enemies of peace. Everyone who protested against the Oslo Accords was called enemies of peace. Not only that, but they would pretty much say everyone who is protesting against the Oslo Accords, if they're religious, is a kahanas. And kahanas had the implication of being the worst form of evil. That's how they presented it. When you look back at 1992 and however they got it through, with whatever deals they made, and you have the protesters today that are saying, shouting, democracy, democracy, this government is a threat to democracy. Compare the results, 92, they got away with it. This is a free election in Israel against all odds and all the defamation and everything. In a free election, the majority of Jews wanted this. And it seems to me, and you probably agree, that really what is at root here is a fight against Israel as a Jewish state. And that seems to be, in my opinion, the essence of the demonstrations. And that seems to be also the essence of the Oslo movement back then, of what that government was about, what the composition was of some of the people. Certainly the Merits, Shulamit Aloni, she was the education minister back then, and she compares the IDF to Nazis. What would you say about that? What's your comment about looking back at 92? And by the way, they made sure when they had Yossi Beilin as the justice minister that Aharon Barak, from the Supreme Court, that he would make these sweeping changes and get away with it until today. So hopefully reform is coming. But what would you say about that?
A couple of comments about 92, comparing yesteryear to today. And I'm going to come back to 92 because the basic law of 92, I'll explain the basic law and how Israel works and why there's a basic law. I do believe in 92 it might have been a seat or two more than the 62 you mentioned. You mentioned that Arafat was brought in. Now, mind you, Oslo became official with the signing of this, what they called a peace treaty with the Palestinians on September 13th, 1993. And September 13th, 1993, I mentioned, I think this on the podcast when I was on last, to me, I think is the darkest day in Israel's modern history for one very simple reason, that we fell into the trap set by the left. You mentioned Yossi Beilin, who actually behind the back of Yitzhak Rabin, even behind the back of Shimon Peres originally, went and began what became the Oslo Accords. But what we did in 93, September 13th, was we shook the hand of the greatest mass murderers since Hitler. And what we did is, I'm talking about Israel, we proclaimed a mass murderer who later became a Nobel laureate a year later, along with Rabin and Peres, as a peace partner. And we've not been able to walk it back since. The peace partner, by the way, in the 18 months that followed, we saw a proliferation of terrorism, unlike any that we'd seen before, only to be outdone once again with the second Intifada in 2000. But nonetheless, Arafat was brought in, and he was brought into Ramallah. And Ramallah obviously is it's part of Eretz Yisrael. It really is Israel. It's part of Israel. And he was brought into Ramallah because the Jews, the Israelis then, were foolish enough to believe, and they remain foolish, that if we give them a capital of a Palestinian entity, mind you, there was no discussion of a Palestinian state. It was a Palestinian entity. If we give them a Palestinian entity and allow them to call Ramallah their capital, well, it might delegitimize their claim for Jerusalem as the capital of a Palestinian state that they want. And I would be remiss if I didn't throw this in as a footnote. We'll come back to it. It's important for anyone who follows the Middle East and the conflict between Israel and the Arabs. And I've said that language is important, and this conflict has been mislabeled as Israeli-Palestinian because it suits the Palestinians for us to call it Israeli-Palestinians, because we become the Goliath and they are the David. They are the underdog, in the world likes that. That concern that Europe had, well, the Jews were once a beleaguered people, is no longer the case. Now the Palestinians become a beleaguered people. But Arafat all of a sudden becomes, and they have a sense of perspective that we're supposed to be the smart ones, didn't. They renamed the PLO, and the PLO, by the way, is fully extant today. What they did is they renamed it the Palestinian Authority. It was a whitewash. It was a better name. And we still refer to Palestinian Authority. And you had mentioned, and I don't think it's a discussion we'll have today, but certainly in a future day, and it might be much sooner than you anticipate. Mahmoud Abbas, the president, the chairman, the president, the king, the emperor of the Palestinian Authority, elected in January of 2006 to a 4-year term. And he, it's like that ever-ready battery. It keeps on going. He's in his 19th year, but he's 87 years old. He's not well, and there's going to be a fight for replacement. So you will be prepared with future broadcasts and podcasts in which we'll be discussing where does the Palestinian Authority go today. But the tragic thing is, in the Western world, they recognize the Palestinian Authority, and in the liberal leftist Israeli world, they recognize the Palestinian Authority as the rightful owners of a Palestinian state that needs to be brought into play. And that Palestinian state isn't going to be in Judea and Samaria, it's going to be the West Bank. It's the West Bank. And this is the conflict that we fight. And all of a sudden we realize that these people who ostensibly consider themselves to be Zionists are aiding and abetting the other side in an anti-Zionist enterprise. But let me just come back to 1992 for a second. In 1992, Rabin was elected, defeated Shamir, and what we had a year and a half later, is we had Oslo, even against his own best interests or best wishes, because, and the point that I was going to make that I think is one that underscores everything we talk about, and this, I will say it slowly because it is essentially the core of the problem. The core of the problem in the Middle East is that the Arabs don't recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, comma, and are more concerned about preventing or eliminating the state of Israel than they are in establishing the state of Palestine. One needs to understand that. And if you don't understand it, you really aren't paying attention. One can go to all the Arab sites. A lot of them are being translated. You can go to Palestinian Media Watch or Memory. There's so many others. The Arabs are quite prolific on social media. And on social media, which they consider to be Arabs speaking to Arabs, in other words, comments and statements made for domestic consumption, they tell us exactly what they want. And that is the elimination of the state of Israel. They don't recognize its right to exist as a Jewish state, and they will do everything and anything using whatever vehicle they can, the United Nations, the European Union, leftists in Tel Aviv, to undermine Israel's legitimacy. And by doing so, they are going to win that war of ideas. It's important that I say this also. It really is important that Israel, for as long as we have been defending it as a modern Jewish state, we've been, and that's the word, defending it. Israel goes to the United Nations and defends its right to exist. We have academics who defend their right to attend international conferences of academia in order to present papers in chemistry or physics or agriculture. They defend their right. They try to convince the rest of the world, which sits in judgment, that we have a right to participate among the family of nations. And in Israel, it's tragic, especially in light of the news of the last 36 hours, we now see the right wing, the nationalists, defending their right to govern a country where they were democratically elected. We are once again defending. And if anyone knows anything about football, you're talking about American football, sometimes the best defense is a good offense. And we need to learn that lesson. What we need to do is accuse them. We need to point that accusatory finger at them. They are the ones who are denying democracy. They're the ones. The people have spoken, and the people spoke that this is the government that they want. And the courts and the left in Israel has simply decided that the people don't have a right to decide. And this is where the courts come into play. because the courts, ever since the Basic Law of 1992, and as I said, there have been several Israel doesn't have a constitution. Israel is one of the few countries, very few countries in the Western world that doesn't have an actual constitution, a written constitution. And in its stead, what they've done is they've created, with the use of the courts and everything else, they've created certain basic laws which adjudicate on various issues, social issues and other political issues which affect the Israeli. And it's happened quite a number of times since 1950. 1950 was the first. I've actually pulled out for our discussion today 2 examples, and it's important, unless you want to interrupt me, for me to present. And can I do that, Mayor?
Do it.
Okay, let me do this first of all. Let me pull out, here, I'm going to pull out from 1958. This is a basic law of 1958, and it's absolutely crucial to the discussion that we've had before in quick detail, and perhaps today in slightly greater detail. 1958, there was a basic law passed, which was going to help the courts, particularly the High Court, the Bagatz, the Supreme Court, decide what is considered constitutional in Israel, even though there's no constitution. I'm going to read just a very quick selection from Rules 7, 7A, 7B, 7A, and then subset 1, 2, 3. And here's what it says. And it talks about the list of candidates. We're talking about who is eligible to run for the Knesset in Israel, therefore representing whatever constituent elects them in government. That's the way democracies work, or are supposed to work. Rule 7A of this 1958 basic law says, the list of candidates shall not participate in elections in the Knesset, and a person should not be a candidate in the elections should there be explicitly, and it goes on to, at the time in 58, and they've actually added one, they offer 3 disqualifiers. I'd mentioned this before very briefly in your podcast, but it's essential that it be discussed today in light of what's happening in the Middle East. There are 3 disqualifiers that this 58 basic law spoke about, and they're very, very simple, and they're not to be misunderstood. 1, negation of the existence of the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. In other words, if a person or party doesn't believe, if they negate Israel's right to exist as a Jewish and democratic state, they are not eligible to run for office in the Knesset in Israel. It's quite clear. No interpretation necessary here. Very simple. No nuance. 2, incitement to racism. That's it. Incitement to racism. 3, support for the armed struggle by an enemy state of a terrorist organization against the state of Israel. Now, that's been changed somewhat only in the separation of the 1, 2, 3, 4. Today, those 3 actually become 4. And it's the same thing that I just said. It's negating the state of Israel as a state of the Jewish people, negating the democratic nature of that state, incitement to racism, and support of an armed struggle. Based on these disqualifiers, there should not be an Arab sitting in the Knesset today. It's that simple. And yet, even when the Central Election Committee has questioned whether or not someone should sit, the courts, the High Court, the Supreme Court comes to their rescue. Let me jump ahead very quickly. This won't take too long. I'm going to the Basic Law of 1992. Basic Law of 1992, that's when Aharon Barak decided to take a chance and basically state that the Supreme Court was allowed to usurp certain rights that were not given to it by any non-constitution that didn't exist. And it wasn't, he wasn't challenged, and it established a precedent that we now are trying to eliminate. And that's what the fight is about today. In that basic law, without going into detail, it talks about different issues. It was officially called Israel Basic Law, Human Dignity and Liberty. What a wonderful thing. Who's going to argue with human dignity and liberty? Section 1A talks about purpose. And it's one sentence. It says the purpose of this basic law is to protect human dignity and liberty in order to anchor in a basic law, because there is no constitution, the values of the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. As a Jewish and democratic state. That phrase, Jewish and democratic, has actually been used by Israel's enemies in the Western world and also in Israel. In the Western world, John Kerry, this was John Kerry's favorite target when he went after Israel. Do you want to be democratic or do you want to be Jewish? You have to decide. You have to decide. The suggestion, of course, being that in order for you to be Jewish, you needed to surrender lands to the Arabs. So demographically, you can still remain a majority in your own state. So in order for you to be Jewish and democratic, you need to give up territories. And therefore, in the smaller truncated Israel, which includes mostly Jews, you can rule. But if you insist on keeping territories which include some Arabs, well, you run the risk that you aren't going to be democratic if you insisted to be Jewish. And this is the game that they play, and they play it time and again. Antony Blinken, in the last 6 months, and I read and listen to every speech he gives, has used democratic, Jewish and democratic, every single time he talks about Israel. He talks about that Israel has to come to terms if it wants to remain a Jewish and democratic state. That is the code word for you need to allow the establishment of a state of Palestine in order for you to remain Jewish, so your population is the majority. And this is the sword which they throw at us. And the left in Israel accepts this argument. And it is absolutely atrocious. Now, last point. From a philosophical point of view, we who consider ourselves to be Zionists, who believe in Zionism is nothing more, nothing less than the Jewish national liberation movement, we believe in a strong and secure Israel. And Israel needs to be a Zionist. It's a Zionist country based on Judaism. What is Zion? I mean, it's the Jewish state. And democratic. And the question was asked by the infamous, the famous, the rabbi, the controversial Rabbi Meir Kahane. And he asked a question a long time ago, a generation and a half ago. He asked a question, it's a very simple question, and it was a challenge to those leftist intellectuals or pseudo-intellectuals. Do you support Israel's right to exist? And their answer, of course, is yes, of course we do. Of course we do. And the question was asked is, if theoretically there is a conflict between Zionism and democracy, which do you pick? And the reason he asked the question then was the demographic numbers were different then. It was before there was this tremendous influx of Russians. One could argue how many of them are Jews at another time, but there was a tremendous influx which changed already the demographic numbers as far as what the Arab percentage was. And also the birth rate. The birth rate was certainly in the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel is quite high. In the Arab world, it's gone down from what it was then. But at the time, there was an issue that demographically, the Arabs were going to become, in a couple of decades, or perhaps less, the majority in Israel. Even in the Galil, there was the concern that the Galileo was going to be Arab. And so the rabbi asked a theoretical question, which his philosophical opponents didn't want to answer. If given a choice of being a Democrat or a Zionist, which do you choose? And he helped them along by saying, do the Arabs have a democratic right in Israel, a democratic right, when they become a majority, if they become a majority, to democratically elect 61 seats in the Knesset, to democratically change the name of Israel to Palestine, remove the Star of David, abolish the law of return, establish a Palestinian or an Arab law of return, all done democratically. Do they have a right to do that? And the people that he debated understood exactly what he was doing. And it was a bear trap they didn't want to put their foot into. And so they avoided the issue. They avoided, because the answer would be, if I'm a Democrat, more than I am a Zionist, then yes, the Arabs have a democratic right to become a majority and to, in essence, destroy Israel democratically. But if I'm a Zionist first, the answer is no, they don't. The democracy in this sense has its limits, and one of the limitations is, and I read you the 4 disqualifiers,
Yep.
the 4 disqualifiers for being a party that can run for the Knesset. So if an Arab party was going to run and it actually fell into one of those 4 categories, and they all do, then they don't have the right to be elected to the Knesset. They don't have the right to vote the 60. There won't be 61 Arabs, no matter what their population is, because they don't recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. That's where the argument should end. But it doesn't. It doesn't, because the other side won't allow it. And when you ask the question, why is it that the Arabs who don't recognize Israel's right to exist are allowed to run in the Knesset, for the Knesset? And the answer is because of Israel's liberal left. I will end with this. I just grabbed an article, a headline, that appeared on August 22nd, a few months ago. The headline is, Arab MK, an Arab member of Knesset, proposes to replace Israel's flag and its national anthem. That was the headline. Now, mind you, this isn't new. When I say it's not new, it's been suggested. It was suggested by Israel's hard left a number of years ago in the 90s. But this headline, this specific headline, Arab MK proposes to replace Israel's flag and national anthem. And I will read you the first sentence. The chairman of Israel's Balad party, MK Sami Abu Shahadeh, recently called to change the Israeli flag, get rid of the national anthem, and cancel the Jewish law of return. He was quoted as saying, "We need to make serious change in the racist structure that discriminates in favor of Jews and build a better democratic," this is their spear, a democratic model. Now, he was asked when he came out by the news media whether or not he supported a shooting attack that had taken place the night before, Arabs shooting at Jews. And his comment was, and here's what he said, yes, the occupation leads to violence. I think the occupation has a lot of victims on the way to its end, that ends in violence and leads to the end of occupation. He's justifying, mind you, a member of Knesset justifies the shooting of Jews because, after all, they were responding to this thing called occupation. And at the time, one of the members of the Otzma Yehudit party, Itamar Ben-Gvir's party, Simcha Rothman, an attorney, good man, from the National Religious Party, because they ran together, came out and he cited what I read a few minutes before. He cited the basic law, he didn't mention 1958, whatever, 7A, which were the disqualifiers. And he, in his response to the media, said, the person who made this comment is a member of Knesset who has no right to be a member of Knesset. What is wrong with us? Why, mind you, a member of Knesset sitting there. And today, and I turn it back over to you, we actually have a Supreme Court in Israel that's decided that Aryeh Deri, head of the Shas party, because he'd made some kind of oblique, I remember at the time, it was a very sloppy use of language, and I think it was done so intentionally, to suggest that if they were easy on him in certain court, to a court case that he confronted where there was possible time in jail, that he would withdraw from he was suggesting, he hinted, it was understood from running for the Knesset, he meant politically, it doesn't really matter. He said he would still continue to lead. But they have decided, they, once again, have put us on the defensive. We're trying to justify why Aryeh Deri, who represents the Shas party, with 11 seats in the Knesset, They got 392,900 votes in the last election. Why he is illegitimate. Why he's illegitimate. I said one more word, but I'm going to throw one more in. There's an Israeli member of Knesset. He's the only Jew who sits on an Arab party. That's Ofer Kasif. Ofer Kasif, notorious leftist, refers to himself as a Marxist and socialist, sort of a hybrid. He sits with the Arab Party. He has referred to the IDF as Judeo-Nazis. He applauds all the Arab terrorists. He refers to them as martyrs. He is this is a person who should be doing a life term in Israel. If he's lucky, there are alternatives. And Ofer Kasif came out when there was a break from the Gilboa prison a number of months ago, where 6 Arab terrorists escaped. 4 were immediately captured, 2 others were on the run and everything else, and he was asked to comment, and he basically said that he lends his support to them because they're not terrorists. They are freedom fighters responding to Jewish terrorism. And I have here, and I just want to tell you what he said at the time. The human soul strives for freedom. The Palestinian soul too. No wall or revenge on the part of the occupier, Gaza, East Jerusalem, or the West Bank, will prevent the Palestinian people from continuing their just struggle for freedom, ending the occupation and liberating it from the murderous repression imposed upon them by Israel. And here's the punchline that I'm coming to. The Central Elections Committee decided, it was before the election, that he was going to be disqualified from running for the Knesset based on the ones that I've mentioned, those disqualifiers. Now, this is the first time ever that they were going to disqualify an individual, not a party. When Rabbi Meir Kahane was disqualified in 1988, it wasn't Meir Kahane, even though he had 1 seat. It was the Kach party which was disqualified. When they tried to disqualify in 1988 the Progressive Peace Party with Mohammed Mayeri, it was the party that they tried to disqualify. Well, in this particular case, they tried to disqualify Ofer Kasif, and saying that whereas the Arab Party that he was part of was allowed to run, he wasn't allowed to run. And here's my punchline. Why is he sitting in the Knesset today? Because the Supreme Court of Israel overruled the Central Election Committee and said that it's fine, despite the fact that he qualifies under every one of those disqualifiers. Well, we're left the Supreme Court, and we sort of usurped all our rights. We aren't a judicial body that interprets the law. We are a judicial activist Supreme Court. And that today is the biggest problem that Israel faces. And thank you for that.
Completely outrageous. Completely outrageous. The Temple Mount, a complete mockery of what they make of Jews. And you have a lot of Jews that are saying, we just want equal rights to pray, just like the Muslims who are there, who hold Hamas rallies and hate our guts and talk and chant death to Jews and Kaibar, Yeh Yechud. That's what they do. According to Judaism, according to Torah and Jewish law, that's our holiest site, the Temple Mount. And our aspirations are for a temple to be built there. And under Jewish law, how it is to be built. And those who could pray there, there's an area for all the different tribes. Shimon and Levi there, Yehuda there, all the different tribes have a function in the Beis HaMikdash. And there's an area for the Leviim and for the Kohanim, and it works in a unity. And there's an area there for people who are not Jewish to pray up there. But there is a but. If you're a Jew hater, no, you have no business being there. It's just common sense also. But Jews are under this thing. We just want equal access, like those who want to kill us. We shouldn't want that. We should want it's ours. And until the Muslim world comes to terms and actually apologizes to the Jewish people for building a mosque on top of our holiest place. Until they apologize, there's not going to be, well, certainly there's not going to be peace. But we have to articulate what it is we want as a Jewish state.
Yeah, we have some very good people on our side who have been fighting, who've been climbing, ascending, going to the Temple Mount, doing all the right things, and yet still is squeamish and almost apologetic in suggesting that when the Western world pressures, Europe has certainly done it, the Biden administration is a strong voice against Israel changing the status quo, and the Israeli government and some very decent people who think that we have a right basically said, no, it's okay. We're not upsetting the status quo. And to me, that's a problem. We need to upset the status quo because the status quo is an anti-Semitic policy imposed by an Arab body that we have allowed to run the temple, our Temple Mount. We have allowed. And I've mentioned before that even the usurpation of language that the Temple Mount is now referred to in a lot of international circles by the State Department in Europe and everything else, the Temple Mount, and they're bringing it into the lexicon of ideas because language controls the debate, controls the narrative, which controls the debate. Haram al-Sharif. It isn't just the Temple Mount. No one, it's interesting. They will say Haram al-Sharif. They'll use that language. But no one says Har HaBayit. I mean, unless you speak Har HaBayit. Why doesn't Antony Blinken say, we believe that all people have rights, whatever, maintain the status quo of Har HaBayit and Haram al-Sharif? They are engaged, I come back to it, in a war of ideas, and we defend, sometimes successfully, sometimes less so. And it's something to be troubled about. The problem that we have, and you've identified it well, Meir, is that in Israel, you have a body of Israelis who basically have taken the cause of the enemy, not simply by waving the PLO flag that they do, but by simply attacking those Jews who want Israel to be the Zionist enterprise that it was meant to be. And in doing so, they don't realize that they are the useful idiots that Lenin spoke about. And when I mention that, we all know that I don't mean John Lennon. They are the useful idiots. And the reason that the Western world has a tool, a vehicle by which to attack Israel and the government policies, especially now that there's a government which they consider so right-wing. It isn't so right-wing, first of all, is because they will, as I do when I lecture, I only quote Arab sources. I quote Hamas, I quote the Palestinian Authority, I quote them, I quote academics. They make the case for me that they don't recognize Israel's right to exist. Well, the left is doing the same thing. They're quoting leftists. They're quoting the Ofer Kassifs in saying, look, Israel, they're Judeo-Nazis. They're occupiers. They are quoting, I know this is a perfect segue. It would not be a podcast if I wouldn't remind people of Pogo, the cartoon character of Possum. We've met the enemy and he is us. And your brilliant tech, there he is. We've got it. There's a tech guy someplace in America who is so quick and quite talented. But anyhow, he on that particular image, Pogo looks better than I do. But nonetheless,
while I'm in the corner here, I'm going to interrupt. I'm going to do an 8-minute presentation on a little history. Now, it's going to be very redundant, but don't go away because I'm going to keep you on the screen. I'd like your feedback, and if there's something you want to say while I'm talking, just stop and I'll stop the tape. But again, for our audience, a lot of stuff I'm about to go over, we've already reviewed, but this will lay it out for you in a much more kind of comprehensive history lesson. So without any further ado, As we know, tonight is a special report, an important report. And the issue that's been discussed pretty much exhaustively, but there's always more to discuss, on the question regarding Zionism and democracy. So what are these protests really about? Well, I'm going to tell you what they're really about. With just a little bit of a touch of a little history lesson, the president of the Supreme Court of Israel from 1995-2006 was President Barak. Oh, no, wrong Barak. Sorry, let me get the right Barak on the screen. That's Aharon Barak, that is. With some similarities, but we'll talk about it later. So who is Aharon Barak? I'm going to give our audience time to absorb each of these little slides because it's a lot of information in a short period of time. So while you're pondering who is Aharon Barak, from 1974 he served as the Dean of the Law Faculty of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I just realized it would be a lot easier for me if I put these on. Ah, there we go. Justice Supreme Court from Israel, Attorney General. He was a pretty prominent figure in the judicial system of the State of Israel, the Jewish State of Israel, I might add. Just in case we're forgetting that, that is the premise of our discussion. And he's a self-described secular Jew. So what is a secular? I wasn't even sure. I've heard the term. So I went and did a little bit of research on some Jewish sites. Secular Judaism is a Jewish identity with little or no attention given to its religious aspects. So he declares himself secular Jew. That's not me saying it. That is Barak saying it. It's a general epithet for Jews who participate in modern secular society who are not religious, including unaffiliated, agnostics, atheists, and cultural Judaism. So I have a question for our audience. Isn't secular Judaism in direct conflict with the very concept of a Jewish state? Little things like Shabbat and prayer. He's not only a secular Jew, but from a political standpoint, he's an ardent judicial activist. Now, I read that in an article, and I didn't really know what a judicial activist was. A judicial philosophy holding that the courts can and should go beyond the applicable law. That's what a judicial activist is. So we have a judicial activist who's a secular Jew who's turning things upside down. They grant the courts the power to overrule an administrative decision if the judge is convinced that it does not stand, and I quote, stand within bounds of reasonableness. So the judges decided that they're going to kind of take over things after the Jewish state from 1948 to 1990s was really going pretty well. So those of you wondering who are in Northern America, in the United States, when a judge strikes down a law on the grounds that it violates individual rights, they do it in the name of Constitution, which was a document put together by people who had love-hate relationships. Some were to the right, some were to the left, some were in the middle, but they came with an amazing document. And that's what's used by the U.S. Supreme Court if the Supreme Court feels that a law or a passage or anything may be what we call unconstitutional. But as Meir Jolovitz said, Israel doesn't have a constitution. So what happened in 1992? The Israel Labor Party formed a coalition with a mere 62 seats. One seat they slid in with Herzog represented the Labor Party. Israel's government included the brand new Merz Party, which was the amalgamation of three alt-left parties. So there we have all of a sudden a turnover in the political system of the State of Israel. So absorb that for a moment while I move on to the next slide here. Here's our Merz Party. And what a party they had. So we've got a secular Jew, an ardent judicial activist, was the center of Israel's political decision-making for almost 30 years. How did that happen? I'll give you time to ponder, because it's pretty amazing what happens next. Prior to the reign of Aaron Barak, the Israeli Supreme Court deferred to the Knesset whenever a case presented a choice between fundamental values and national security. National security won. But under his reign, Israel's longtime practice of placing security, community, and survival of the Jewish state and the protection of the Jewish people used to be Israel's #1 priority. It makes sense. But this concept was abolished. It no longer was priority. The priority was equal rights to everyone, to Jew haters, to Palestinians, to Iranians, anyone who happened to be within the boundaries of Israel. So how did this happen? I mean, no doubt that Aaron Barak was an extremely intelligent, well-educated man. He was also clever and used impeccable, unethical timing to push his plan into being. Think back to 1995. What happened? A tragedy. Rabin was assassinated. It was Israel's darkest hour. All over the world, all over Israel, everybody was distracted. And it's like in magic, we call it misdirection. So we had a little decoy. So while Israel's entire planet was focused on tragic events, the court unilaterally, without discussion, without debate, decided that the new basic laws amounted to a formal constitution, giving the court unprecedented power of judicial review over primary legislation. Again, while the world was looking in one direction, that's when he decided he's going to take things over with this radical, earth-shattering decision that most people didn't even notice was going on because they were more concerned about the assassination. So absorb that for a moment while I find my next slide around here. But some people did recognize what was going on. One of those was Ruth Gavis, Israeli expert on human rights of all things, professor of law, Hebrew University, recipient of the Israel Prize. She said, nowhere else in the world is there a situation in which judges have control over the process of appointing judges. But obviously her voice wasn't strong enough to overturn it, because everybody else was still focused on the assassination. It was Richard Posner, who's United States federal appellate judge, an authority on jurisprudence, author of almost 40 books, and he was a valedictorian, by the way, of his Harvard Law School class. So I think he's pretty up there in the intelligence level. Only in Israel do judges confer the power of abstract review on themselves without benefit of a constitutional or legislative provision. This was his response to the circumstances. He said that the approach Barak took involves interpretation based on his own personal ideal system, that of a secular Jew who is an activist. Who else went up against this? Rubinstein, an Israeli legal scholar, politician, and presently he's the dean of the Antizionist Center in Herzliya. The Israel Supreme Court under Barak has given it the reputation of the most activist court in the world. The Supreme Court under Barak has become an alternate government. Other vehement opponents was the legendary Moshe Landau, Supreme Court Justice, who's a providing judge at the trial of Adolf Eichmann. So I think he's pretty substantial. He lived to the age of 99, by the way. He spoke out in fierce opposition to Barak's ploy to take over. During the same years of the left-wing judicial system overhaul, with Ehud Barak at its helm and the Labour Party in control, remember, by one seat in the Knesset. They're saying that now's a problem. We have a lot more seats in Knesset than they did, and we're taking over. Yasser Arafat was welcomed into Israel, and the PLO was supplied with PLO, with cash, and with weapons, allegedly to fight Hamas. Who are they joking? I mean, they're not fighting Hamas. They're with Hamas. They are Hamas. According to the Washington Post, For years, Arafat has used numerous intermediaries, Western, Palestinian, and Israeli, to convey the evolution of his views to the Labour Party leadership. In Israel, knowing that any dialogue with the hardline Likud bloc was a lost cause, as it should have been to all Israelis. And there he is. I mean, do they forget who they're dealing with? Are their memories so short? There he is, that same Arafat who was welcomed in Israel.
People are making a mistake by saying it makes Israel less democratic. In one sense, it makes Israel more democratic, that is more subject to the will of the majority in the Knesset. That this is something that many countries are going through today. The United States is going through the same debate, except in the United States it's the left that wants to weaken the Supreme Court because they're not satisfied with some of their decisions, and Israel is the right.
The attempt to restore the right balance between the branches is not a destruction of democracy, but the strengthening of democracy.
This is not democracy when the Supreme Court of 15 people who are not elected by the people control everything in this country. This is not a democracy anymore. Now we are marching to democracy.
Guys, back to you. I'm taking a break.
Well, that was brilliant. That was unbelievable, that presentation. It fits into everything that we've been saying, and it's well put together. I hope this particular broadcast gets shared widely because this information is vital. Meir, after that presentation, you see, I mean, you know, you gave a good rundown about everything. That was pretty concise. Volume.
Okay. I said I look at the clock and I see that the clock is ticking, and I have to go out and save Western civilization.
Okay.
So, no, so knowing that, I will say, as I began, there is a war going on. It's a war of ideas, and if we don't start paying attention, it's a war that we're going to lose. I applaud you. It's to make. But we need to fight. We need to fight strong. We need to fight strong.
Absolutely. Meir, let me thank you for joining us tonight. We'll have you on more times. This is the topic. And like you brought up also, that our Rabbi Meir Kahane, this was what he was talking about for the future of Israel. Make the choice. Jewish state, not Jewish state. Let's talk about it. That's what the center of this whole issue is right now. And we certainly know that those who are protesting against this government, Saturday nights, they don't want Israel as a Jewish state. There's no question about it. They're against that. Let me thank everybody for joining us, watching this. Please share this on whatever platforms you use. We'll reach a lot more people. We'll get the message across. It's a very powerful message. And thank God we do have access to social media to get the word out, because that's what we want to do. We want to get the word out. We want as many of our people to be thinking and to speak properly about what the issues are. We want Israel to be a Jewish state, and the Jewish people have the potential to make it into such a proud, strong, thriving Jewish state. Let's do it. Thank you very much. Please share this, and we'll be with you again. Shalom, shalom.
Shalom Aleinu.